In 2010, the largest manhunt in modern British history was launched when Raoul Moat declared war on Northumbria Police.
Hello, Linda.
For somebody to actively hunt a police officer, it's so sick.
In just
How
1
you
week,
doing?
the 37-year-old ex-con murdered and maimed in a vengeful rampage.
You would have seen at least one policeman at any time, full body armour, gun the lot.
For 7 days, the former bouncer evaded over 500 officers,
We had no idea where he was. and this man
It's been
still
okay.
was gone.
sending a wave of terror through rural Northumberland.
I thought, I'm sure to be next. At this rate, I was just petrified.
But what caused this father of three to
Not
snap
really,
and embark on a deadly killing spree?
There's really only one way it's going to end.
I'm coming to get you. I'm not on the run. I am coming to get you.
Yeah, it's Mother's Day today and I'm not really...
The 3rd of July, 2010, Newcastle upon Tyne, England. A city known for its industrial past and vibrant nightlife.
Over the years, Newcastle has acquired a real reputation as a party
Not
city.
the only
It's
one, my
incredibly
sweet
popular
Linda.
with stag do's and heading do's, and there's a really vibrant nightlife.
Like I said, it's Mother's Day today and I'm not really...
friendly place, and it's the sort of city where you will run into the same people in the same pubs and clubs.
It's by no means a crime hotspot. In fact, it's a
If you know
really
what I
safe
mean.
area to live. So to experience what we experienced in July 2010
Yeah, I know.
was way out of the normal for this area.
Well, if you want to
As
talk
Friday
private,
night
you're more
became
than
Saturday
welcome to,
morning,
my sweet.
revellers filled Newcastle's clubs and bars, unaware that just 7 miles away, one party was about to come to a tragic end. 2:30 a.m. Berkeley. The
Today.
sound of gunfire was about to ring out through the quiet residential streets.
It's today.
Following a night out at a local bar, Samantha Stoddart and Christopher Brown visited a friend's house.
Hence my
Samantha
post.
And her new boyfriend Christopher.
What I did.
Were, enjoying a social evening with her parents and friends.
The young couple were unaware that an armed man with deadly intent was hiding in wait outside. As their evening drew to a close, Samantha and Christopher prepared to leave.
When both Samantha and Christopher emerged for the house, he confronted them. He immediately
never,
shot Christopher in the upper body, and then as Christopher tried to run away,
Put it.
he shot him a second time. While he was lying injured, he reloaded the gun,
Mother's Day and Father's
Shot.
Day is always going to be hard,
defenseless,
especially for me.
injured Christopher on the ground.
The third shot proved to be fatal.
He then turned his attention to Samantha, who was by this time inside the house, and he fired a shot through the window, and then he calmly walked away.
With one dead and
Yeah,
another
I
critically
just wish she
injured,
was here.
local journalist Sophie Doughty was one of
I
the
know
first to report
she's
on the
here
deadly
in
spree.
spirit, etc. But
The 3rd of July 2010 was a normal Saturday shift for us, or so we thought when we came in. We rang around the emergency services, got caught up with anything that had been happening overnight, and told us that there was an incident going on in Berkeley. When we started releasing details, they described it as a domestic disturbance. When we got to
Yeah.
the scene, local people
I'm just
were
gonna chill
telling
out with
us
this
that,
puzzle and,
a man had
you
been
know,
released from prison
and just,
got out there, shot his ex-girlfriend and shot
listen
her
to the
new
crime
partner.
shows
As the morning wore on, we were asking people, do you know who her ex-boyfriend
while
was? And
I'm
the
doing
name
this
Raoul Moat was
puzzle,
mentioned.
and it's already doing my head in. But hey ho.
Born on June the 17th, 1973, Raoul Thomas Moat had an unstable childhood.
He's always been looking for his dad from being young, and his mum would never say who his dad was.
He said a lot that he lacked a father figure, he lacked a standard, normal family life.
His early years were further complicated by his mother's mental health issues.
His mum was never there, was always living with his gran. She used to show him all like the good qualities of life and look after him. He idolised her, and that was his main big happy zone.
His mother remarried in 1986, and Raoul Moat's teenage years were marked by a fractious relationship with his stepfather.
His stepdad didn't like Raoul too much. He used to be off with him all the time. I don't even think that his mum was really looking after him too well either. So he was getting a bit more withdrawn.
At the age of 24, Moat severed contact with his family, and after a series of failed relationships, met Samantha Stobbart in 2004.
The one thing that Raoul Moat was desperate to have was a stable family life. The one thing he didn't have as a child. And this he thought he would get with Samantha Stobbart.
But their 6-year relationship broke down in 2010 when Moat was imprisoned for the assault of a relative. The 1st of July 2010, 11 a.m. Her Majesty's Prison, Durham. Moat was released after serving just over 2 months of a 16-week sentence, devastated by his broken relationship with Samantha Stobbart.
That time in prison gave him time to think. His jealousies were emphasised. His feelings of mistrust towards Samantha were amplified.
Immediately after being granted his freedom, he began to meticulously gather supplies for an attack, and armed himself with a sawn-off shotgun, modifying the ammunition to make it even more lethal.
A normal shotgun cartridge would contain an amount of ball bearings on top of the explosive charge. Moat removed a portion of those ball bearings and packed in smaller items of metal in there. And I guess his mindset behind that was to cause maximum damage.
At 2:40 a.m. on the 3rd of July, just 48 hours after his release, Moat put his plan into action, gunning down his ex-girlfriend Samantha Stobbart and her new partner Christopher Brown. On the surface, a vengeful attack by a jilted lover, but deep down, a festering resentment remained, and Raoul Moat's bloody spree was just beginning.
Lost everything through you. I'm coming to get you. I'm not on the run. I am coming to get you.
The 3rd of July 2010, Bertley, Tyne and Wear, watched over by the iconic Angel of the North. Overnight, this small town had become the scene of a violent crime. Less than 48 hours after being released from prison, 37-year-old Raoul Moat had shot his ex-girlfriend Samantha Stobbart and murdered her new boyfriend Christopher Brown in a deadly killing spree. Moat had met Samantha 6 years earlier in 2004. He was a 31-year-old bouncer working in Newcastle's thriving club scene. She was just 16 years old.
She had fake ID to get in because she was underage. And then he just met her from there, and that's when he started meeting her, and he just seemed to fell in love with her.
He was a bodybuilder, so he used to wear these cut-out vests that showed everything off. So, yeah, he was really proud of his muscles, and he thought he looked great. She was young, she was good looking, she had a fantastic figure, and he was a lot older than her, and I think all his birthdays had come at once because he'd met her.
After 6 years together, Samantha gave birth to a baby girl, and Moat became a father once more, having also won custody of 2 daughters from a previous relationship.
I think being a father was very important to Raoul. It was something that he aspired. He aspired to be a good father. He had children from previous relationships to Samantha, and things hadn't worked out there. He hadn't achieved the perfect family.
he had difficult, fractious relationships with girlfriends. He had difficult relationships with his children, and he had an incredibly difficult relationship with Samantha Stobbart. He was a big character. He was a big figure. He was intimidating.
Moat has admitted to domestic violence in previous relationships, specifically with Sam Stobbart. He did that in a way where he portrayed her as being provocative, as if Sam made him do it. And this is something we see very commonly with domestic violence perpetrators.
It was always Samantha's fault. Samantha shouldn't agitate him, or Samantha shouldn't do this, or he would hit her, she would come over here.
Hey, Kitty.
And he would come over here and sweet talk her, and she'd go
Is it easier?
back, and then she would be back for a few months, and he would have an
Yeah,
argument,
oh, it
and
is.
he'd hit her again, so she was back again.
They position themselves to be the victim of emotional abuse or provocation, and they say they lash out because they tried to be reasonable, they've done everything else they could. Yet again, this is just an example of a narcissist manipulating the truth.
On the 10th of June 2010, whilst he was behind bars, Samantha took the opportunity to put a definitive end to her abusive 6-year relationship with Moat, fabricating a story that her new partner was a police officer.
When Moat shot and killed Chris Brown at point-blank range, Moat was still of the belief that Chris Brown was a police officer.
Christopher Brown wasn't a police officer. That was simply something Samantha had used to try and keep Moat away.
He was a karate instructor, and he was delivering leaflets round the doors when she met him.
He just seemed like a normal lad who was trying to make a go of it, and his only sort of mistake, if you can call it a mistake, was he started a relationship with Raoul Moat's estranged girlfriend.
She thought that by telling him her new boyfriend was a police officer, it would persuade Raoul to keep his distance. She couldn't have picked a worse profession in the world. He had a long-running hatred and paranoia about the police, and this was yet another way in which he thought the police had taken something away from him.
Moat had a history of dealings with Northumbria police.
The vendetta he thought the Northumbria police had against him stretched back many, many years, largely based on fairly minor incidents.
The police were always pulling him over for the slightest thing, and he was just absolutely sick of it. He says, every time I pull into a petrol station and there's a policeman there, they stop us.
They would just pull him over, they'd check his fuel, they'd check his tyres. It was just like a non-stop harassment, so he was always on edge.
He became very paranoid about the police. His house had CCTV cameras around it. He recorded all his phone calls with social services and with the police.
He blamed them for his businesses going bust. He blamed them for constantly being harassed.
I said, you must have some reason. He says, I've never done anything.
I think for Moat that was his default setting. When something didn't go right in his life, he blamed the police.
And he only had one route left to take in his eyes, which was to take revenge.
29 minutes past midnight, July the 4th, less than 24 hours after the shootings in Berkeley, Raoul Moat made a chilling phone call to the communications centre at Northumbria Police Headquarters.
Hello there, this is Big Gunman from Berkeley last night. My name is Raoul Moat. What I'm phoning about is to tell you exactly why I've done what I've done, right? Now, my girlfriend has been having an affair behind my back with one of your officers, this gentleman that I shot last night.
Northumbria police had received one phone call from Raoul Moat, effectively making full admissions to shooting Christopher Brown, admissions to shooting Samantha, but more worryingly and sinister, declaring an effective war, if you like, on Northumbria police officers.
And you police have took too much off me over the years. I'm coming to get you. I'm not on the run. I am coming to get you. I've lost everything through you, right? Just won't leave us alone, right? Because I am hunting for officers now.
Earlier that evening, traffic officer PC David Rathband was starting his late shift, with the force under heightened alert for the spree gunman from the previous night.
David was a very proactive police officer. He completely understood the job. It's what he wanted to do. It was his calling, I think.
45 minutes past midnight. Moments after Moat's phone call to the police, PC Rathband was sitting in his patrol car, unaware that his life was about to be turned upside down.
David had decided to sit up on the A1, one of his favourite stopping points, to sit up somewhere where it's very busy, where there's a high volume of traffic coming past and waiting. That's what it all comes down to, playing the waiting game. Then maybe that opportunity for that vehicle, that one vehicle you're looking for, will come past. Unfortunately for David, that night it did.
PC Rathband was unaware Moat had changed vehicles and was now travelling in a black Lexus.
The vehicle he was expecting or hoping to see had been dumped earlier on that day. That intelligence hadn't got out yet. And so David was effectively sat there waiting, looking for something that wasn't going to come past. The individual he was looking for did, though, in another car, and that's when it all went horribly wrong.
Just moments after making his call to the emergency services, Moat's threat to the police became a brutal reality as his sickening spree continued.
Moat, it transpires, drives past and sees David sat in his police car on his own, and decides to stop just on the on-slip for the motorway.
He got out and, carrying a sawn-off shotgun, he crept up to a marked police car. PC Rathband was aware that somebody was behind his car. He turned, looked, and saw this large man holding a gun, pointing at him through the passenger window, and his last thought before he was shot was, "Oh no, it's Ralph Moat." And for that split second, he knew it was about to happen.
David had been horrifically injured. He'd been shot twice in the face. He was left blind there and then. It's not the done thing, is it, to shoot a police officer? There's a line there that people don't cross. For somebody to actively go out and hunt a police officer, it's so sick.
Leaving his third victim fighting for his life, Raoul Moat disappeared into the night amidst fears that his spree was far from over.
There was a real sense of concern that PC Rathband wasn't going to be the final victim.
Minutes later, an agitated Moat called Northumbria Police once more.
I've just opened her up, so they're rolling over the west end of Newcastle. Yeah. Well, absolutely not going to stop. You're going to have to kill me. Right. They're not going to stop.
He rang again, making it clear that he was responsible for shooting David Rathband, and again emphasising that he would be willing to shoot more police officers. He will come looking for us.
The gunman's behaviour was becoming increasingly irrational. Northumbria Police called an emergency press conference in an attempt to reach out to Moat.
You have told us that the police are not taking you seriously. I can assure you we are. I want you to know that you have our full attention. Innocent people have been hurt. This must stop now.
With one dead, two in a critical condition, and with clear intent to kill again, the elusive Moat needed to be caught before his killing spree claimed further victims.
We had no idea where he was. We had no idea where he was hiding out. And every inquiry that we made that was an attempt to secure his arrest was going to involve specialist firearms officers.
There was a major manhunt then that was launched, and it became apparent that it was a story that none of us had ever experienced before in our careers.
In the period when we didn't know where Raoul Moat was, you know, there were armed police raids going on all over Tyneside, and it was moving all the time, but still there was no sign of Raoul Moat.
And I was completely terrified that week the police were looking for him. And I just never went to bed. I slept on the settee for the full week. It was just terrifying.
Less than 24 hours after the shooting of PC Rathband, an unexpected twist emerged, and Moat's ruthless spree threatened to escalate further.
Late on a Sunday afternoon was two separate reports, which suggested that he may have had hostages with him. And those were coming from the family of Carl Ness and the family of Coramawai.
As is typical in a hostage situation, the police request to the media that we don't report that information because it may affect the safe recovery of the hostages.
The dynamic became very, very complicated because we had an obligation to those hostages to try and save their lives. That caused some issues in terms of how we proceeded with the manhunt.
The police were now aware that Moat was travelling in a black Lexus, and the net was closing in on him.
It made a distinctive engine noise. It was quite noisy. And when we appealed to the public to help us find that car, very, very quickly it was identified and its location was identified. And our focus moved from almost the time in Muir conurbation to the rural countryside of Northumberland to Rothbury.
As the search moved into a new area, and with the lives of two hostages in his hands, the need to find Moat took on a new urgency. His savage spree was potentially spiralling out of control.
This man had threatened to kill police officers. This man had already shot a police officer. And this man, as far as we knew, still had his gun.
"29 minutes past midnight, the 4th of July 2010. Raoul Moat called the emergency services and declared war on Northumbria Police.
I'm coming to get you. I'm not on the run. I am coming to get you.
Moments later, he ambushed traffic officer PC David Rathband as he sat in his patrol car, shooting him twice at point-blank range before vanishing into the night with two hostages. Police had released details of Moat's vehicle, a black Lexus, and sightings were quickly reported in the community of Rothbury. Less than an hour outside of Newcastle, this small market town sits in the rolling hills of Northumberland.
If you drive north from Newcastle, Rothbury's the first nice place you come to. It's everyone's idea, a little village in the hills.
It's quite quaint, everybody knows everybody else. It's a really tight community. It's just a lovely, wonderful place, and it's just beautiful.
But Rothbury was about to become the focus of the world's attention.
Until the police car rode up the street, it was just an ordinary day, and I think the last thing we expected was to have anything to do with the whole Moat saga at all.
On the morning of the 6th of July, 3 days after Moat's spree had begun, the black Lexus was found abandoned in a local car park.
Just got to the office and I got a phone call to say Raoul Moat's car's been found in Rothbury, get here now. I just thought, oh my god, this is big, this is huge, this is something that's never happened before in our paper's history.
The hunt for the gunman and his hostages intensified as police resources poured into the immediate area.
When it first started, if you look down here, you would have seen at least one policeman at any time, full body armour, gun the lot.
The manhunt would soon reach unprecedented levels, involving over 500 officers. A 2-mile exclusion zone was set up in the Rothbury area.
Anything that involved sighting or any arrest of Raoul Moat was going to involve the use of armed police officers. There was no other way to do it.
With the police on high alert for a potential hostage standoff, the story was about to take an unexpected turn.
Raoul Moat had already revealed that he had taken some hostages, but it became apparent as well that the police were unsure as to whether they were the hostages or accomplices.
Carl Ness and Karam Awan were in fact in collusion with Moat. They had each delivered 2 messages to their families. One appeared to be a genuine hostage letter, but the second was a note explaining that they were actually in the safe hands of their friend, Raoul Moat. Their concerned families submitted these letters to the police.
While we were quickly trying to get our resources moved, Moat was able to melt into the countryside, whereas Ness and Awan tried to make their escape along the open road. The police helicopter was very quickly above them.
One police car drove past them with an officer in to possibly identify them. Once he did that, he radioed to colleagues who followed in a second police car unmarked to throw a thunderflash at their feet. This momentarily stunned them, and other officers came out and arrested them at gunpoint.
With Ness and Awan in custody, the full extent of their involvement in Moat's spree started to become clear.
How are you
Raoul Moat
feeling?
and Carl Ness were close friends, Awan less so, but they went with him on his exercise of revenge and murder. They drove him around on the night that he shot PC Rathband. Carl Ness was with him and drove him to Samantha Stobart's house. So there was no doubt that they were fully involved.
Footage emerged that revealed the movements of Moat and his accomplices before and during his spree.
They're caught on CCTV, buying him things from Tesco and places. They even, to them it seemed like a bit of an adventure. They were buying barbecue sauce and all sorts of everyday items to help Moat.
But what led 2 men to assist Raoul Moat in his vengeful rampage?
He was highly manipulative. He was able to make people feel as if they were in the wrong, as if they'd wronged him, and that gave him leverage and purchase to get other people to do what he wanted them to do.
They were very unusual characters in this because they didn't seem to gain anything other than, in a way, looking up to Moat. They wanted to impress him. They were more than willing to help him carry out these horrific acts, and there was nothing in it for them.
Carl Ness, a bodybuilder and former nightclub doorman, had known Moat for several years, having also worked as a bouncer in Newcastle. During Moat's incarceration, Ness had been in regular contact with Moat through prison visits and telephone calls.
But one conversation was really interesting in that he asked Ness to get a particular individual to visit him while he was in prison, because he was an individual who could get him what he described as a car with 6 wheels. And when we looked at the people involved, my only explanation for a car with 6 wheels is a gun and the associated ammunition.
The 7th of July 2010, Rothbury, Northumberland. The day following the arrests of Awan and Ness. With Moat still at large, police discovered a makeshift campsite where he'd been hiding out. Amongst the debris,
Yes,
a
I do
disturbing
hope that
message
goes
from
soon.
Moat was found,
Not very nice.
forcing the police to take urgent action.
The police called us all in for an emergency press conference and told us that they'd found a dictaphone that Moat had left in one of the places that he'd been camping out. On that, he gives details of the fact that he's been following the media coverage, that he'd been angered by it.
He was getting very, very agitated by the way he was being portrayed in the press. And he decided that, or he declared on that dictaphone, that for every lie that was told, he would shoot an innocent member of the public.
Information has now emerged that Mr. Moat has made threats towards the wider public.
Fearing for public safety, a media blackout was imposed.
Police told us about this threat and the request to not publish the material that might upset Raoul Moat. When they explained the reason why, I think it was a collective...
Yes, I hope you and your lovely wife gets better.
None of us wanted to put anyone at any further risk than they already were at.
The 8th of July, 2 days after the arrest of Ness and Awan, and Moat was still on the run.
He no longer had a car, he no longer had access to money, or as far as anyone knew, no longer had access to the outside world. He wasn't in touch with anybody else. So his ability to move around had clearly been reduced.
But how was this former nightclub bouncer evading capture in the Northumbrian wilderness?
He knew he had a love of Rothbury.
Hope you feel better soon then, see?
He enjoyed camping. It was an area that was familiar to him.
You're right,
We
Rocket.
actually spoke to an ex-girlfriend of his.
No
who
fun
lived in
being
the
ill.
village. He used to go fishing there. He knew the area, so he knew what he was doing.
You always feel
You're
more
moving along, you
comfortable in an
see.
environment that you're familiar
Told you
with.
that's the way to do it.
You know, you can relax, get in tune, take stock.
Build
and
your
then
row of
apart from
houses
there.
across. Eh?
Despite the 2-mile exclusion zone set up by the police, the challenging terrain provided Moat with plenty of opportunities to remain invisible.
It's quite rugged terrain. There's lots of farms, there's lots of fields. There's probably lots of
Oh,
places
yeah.
you could hide out that
Yeah.
a lot of people wouldn't know about.
If you look at the amount of forest round here, that's a great place to be straight away because
House
the
is not the
helicopter
bottom
can't see
part.
you.
Just get all the houses joined
No, I'm
first.
just
The mnemonic we use
Yeah.
when we're
looking
looking
at
at
the
heights,
line.
that mnemonic is bliss.
Because I can...
Yeah.
It was
The
the
B
line that
stands
I
for
got them
blend.
to.
You've got to look
My
at the
ass
place
is
and
raw.
try and blend in
I'm
with the
sorry,
natural
NC.
environment.
Oh,
House
fucking
stands for
hell.
low. When people are looking for you, there's
Well,
almost like a natural tendency to just
In
look
all
at eye
honesty,
level.
at least you guys
The
know
eye is
how I
irregular.
feel.
Make it irregular. Stay away from straight
Or have
lines.
been feeling.
The S is for small. Keep it small. Anything too big, and it's just going to jump out at you. And the last one, the second S, is secluded.
Once you get out of here, you are in the middle of nowhere. That's a good place to hide out.
But it's
No
not
one going to see you.
a
There's
bug
nobody there to
for
see
me.
As the police search continued with no reported sightings of Moat, tension in the Rothbury area was rising.
People were scared. Everyone was conscious that there was a...
Bless you, and see,
on the
lots
loose.
of luck to you and your wife.
Rumours were rife, and fears were growing that the gunman could even be living amongst them.
There were rumours that Raoul Moat had gone into the centre of the village during the manhunt.
Just over here is a storm drain where it's thought that Raoul Moat was hiding out.
People were saying that there are storm drains that lead underneath the village, that you could go from remote area and actually end up coming up through a drain in the village.
So you can nip in the early hours of the morning and just become a scavenger. Scavenging in the bins, in allotments, greenhouses.
These are the gardens behind the wall where it's thought that Raoul Moat was going in to steal vegetables and food.
Like the guy at the bottom of the village who found that his tomatoes were going missing.
I mean, there were different sightings of him in different
Hello,
places.
Scratch
There was
Master.
a house that he potentially
Hello,
went into
Scratch
and
Master.
lay down on the bed because a resident had reported like an imprint of his head in their pillow.
As Moat continued to remain one step ahead of the police, local residents were becoming increasingly unnerved.
Well, I think there was a little moment of panic because obviously when the police are telling you to get in, lock the doors, stay away from the windows, you're assuming there's going to be bullets flying all over the place.
No one quite knew how much ammunition or how many guns he had possession of. And there was a real sense of fear throughout the area.
When public safety is your priority, the police had saturated Rothbury, so that in the event of any sighting or any confrontation between a member of the public and Moat, the police were on the heartbeat away.
At 7:25 p.m. on the 9th of July, 6 days after the vengeful rampage began, a member of the public reported sighting a man answering Moat's description on the banks of the river near the centre of Rothbury. As armed police descended, a standoff developed as Moat raised the gun used to carry out his deadly spree. But this time, The weapon was pointing at his own head.
It was his intention that it would end in that field in Rothbury that night.
Cowardly way.
At 2:40 a.m. on the 3rd of July 2010, Raoul Moat embarked on a vengeful killing spree, leaving 1 dead and 2 more critically wounded. Moat's car was finally found abandoned 3 days after his rampage began in the quaint Northumbrian town of Rothbury.
We have right.
7:25
dokie,
p.m.,
Rocket.
the 9th of July,
Catch you later.
Rothbury Riverside. Having evaded capture for a further 3 days, a member of the public reported sighting Moat on the banks of the River Coquette.
Reports came through that he'd finally been cornered in an area on the edge of Rothbury town centre.
Press and public were immediately cleared from the area as armed police descended on the scene.
Ladies and gentlemen, for your own safety, I need you to move back.
Raoul Moat was just in front of the tree over there. Police were kind of on this road here.
Being local, we knew straight away where it was, and we knew he wasn't going to get away.
He sunk to his knees, put the gun to his head, and the next final hours of Moat's life were played out on the riverbank.
As the standoff between police and Raoul Moat unfolded, the nation was captivated by rolling 24-hour news.
It was a waiting game during the hours where there was a standoff between Moat and the police.
It was live on every news channel that there was.
And as journalists at the newspaper, all we could do was watch and wait.
Just being glued to
See you
the
later,
television
Rocket.
at night and waiting for things to happen.
The whole world seemed to be transfixed on what was happening in Rothbury.
That whole process of getting him to surrender was happening. And it went on and on.
This is where the standoff took place. It was around this area here. It's where Raoul Moat was with the gun underneath him.
Our armed officers, our negotiators were there for the long haul.
Behind the scenes, police had been analysing Moat's behaviour throughout the spree, preparing for every eventuality.
Because Moat had made contact with us a couple of times on telephone, there was always a likelihood that we were going to confront him face to face. So a team of negotiators had been working all week for that eventuality. They knew his background, they knew what made him tick, and they knew what annoyed him.
He spoke emotionally about close relationships. He was immune to any requests that they made of him.
And staff tried to persuade him that killing himself was not the only option.
After 6 hours of negotiation, the mood of the stalemate changed as Moat became increasingly agitated.
Couldn't really see what was happening, but you could hear that there was a commotion.
At that point, it was clear to everybody present that he had made his mind up, that he was ready to finish the whole episode.
The police attempted to incapacitate Moat with a shotgun-style taser.
At about 1:15 in the morning, about 6 hours now after the standoff had started, there were a couple of sounds which clearly sounded like gunshots, and there were a couple of shouts.
It wasn't quite clear at that point, as the story broke, as to what had happened. Was it Moat committing suicide? Was it the police trying to take action?
At approximately 1:15 a.m, almost immediately after the police tasers were discharged, Raoul Moat fired the final shot of his killing spree.
Shortly after, an ambulance crew took him to Newcastle General Infirmary, and shortly after his arrival there, it became known that he was actually dead, and he'd taken his own life with a shotgun
After the biggest British manhunt of a generation, involving over 500 police officers and costing Northumbria Police in excess of £1 million, Raoul Moat's ruthless rampage was finally over.
With him, it seemed as though it had come to a point where he didn't have anything. And when you get to that point, when you start feeling like that, then there's really only one way it's going to end.
And he had actually said to the negotiators that it was his intention that it would end in that field in Rothbury that night.
Once you come out to an environment like this, particularly on your own, it gives you a lot of time to self-reflect. Come the end of it, I think because he'd been out for 3 days in a while, I think he kind of thought hard about what he's done and who he's let down, including himself. And I think that's why it ended the way it did. I think it had finally come to it, and he just hit the point of no return.
In the wake of Moat's bloody violence, one question remained. What drove the former bouncer and bodybuilder to commit these terrible crimes?
Moat was an individual who could not cope with all of the things that were happening to him that were going wrong. And there often tends to be a triggering event, something that happens in the immediacy that they can't cope with, that tends to push them over the edge.
Jealousy, pure jealousy, that I think has done it. Jealousy that he couldn't have Samantha, so he was going to make sure nobody else had her.
He couldn't change his situation with Stowburn. There was nothing he could do to win her back. She'd replaced him with what he was fearful of was a better man.
He didn't want to go quietly. He thought, if I'm going to lose everything, I want everyone to know that. I want to get revenge on people that have wronged me, but also I don't want them to forget me. I'm not just going to walk away. I'm going to make people notice me.
And that's the key hallmark of spree killers with narcissistic backgrounds. They blame everybody else, they blame society, they blame the authorities, and other people need to be made to pay.
The 29th of February 2012, 19 months after the devastating spree. Having been shot and blinded by Raoul Moat, PC David Rathband took his own life at his home in Blythe, Northumberland.
David is gone. I miss my friend. I still can't quite bring myself to delete his number off of my phone. It's still there.
Would David Rathband have taken his own life had he not been blinded by Raoul Moat? I personally doubt it very much. Samantha Stobbart still bears the scars, and I'm sure she probably finds it difficult to move on. And Christopher Brown lost his life.
Christopher's mum, Sally,
feels like her sons have forgotten what he and I tend to agree with.
On the 11th of March 2011, Moat's accomplices, Carl Ness and Karama Wan, were convicted of the attempted murder of PC David Rathband and conspiracy to murder police officers. Ness was also convicted of the murder of Christopher Brown.
When you look at Carl Ness, he was given a 40-year life sentence. And Wan, he was given 20-year life sentences. You think, what would Moat have got? And I think I'd rather see him accounting for his criminality, for the deaths of Christopher and David. I'd rather see him accounting for them in prison rather than taking the easy route, which he did, which was cowardly.
Eh? I've got everything on. I know all the veg and stuff. Potatoes. And cabbage is cooking now. Sweetheart cabbage.
I love cabbage. as well, no? And there might be somewhere in this map.
That ain't right. It's been forced together, that. Look, we don't even match up. Yeah, that's just been forced together. And that.
I'll check that out then.
That matches. That's why you couldn't find that piece. And I bet that's that piece. No, it's not.
You were saying?
Yeah, but that's why you couldn't find it. That was the wrong way around.
Deranged killers, whose scarily bent minds send them on a mission to murder.
The voices told him that it was God's plan, that people had to be sacrificed.
From whom no one is safe.
He said he was going to go door to door like the Avon lady. He said, "Ding dong, you're dead."
I found a used yogurt cup, and we had been drinking the blood in that cup.
Forensic psychologist Lou Schlesinger has spent decades delving into the minds of serial killers.
The types of murders that we're talking about are extraordinary murders. Motive, method, opportunity, that goes out the window.
Serving detective Jackie Sabir is an expert in the mechanics of murder.
These crimes are opportunistic, so there's no way to get ahead of the game. You're going to start wondering who's next.
Between them, they're analysing one of history's most disturbed killers.
He was like a dead man walking. There was no emotion, there was nothing.
He sent me a note saying, "I want you to get me into the Chamber of Horrors."
And investigating if its perpetrator was born to join this most bizarre of clubs. With over 20 years' experience in homicide, Detective Jackie Sabir has worked on some of Britain's most high-profile murder investigations. She's travelled northwest of London to analyse a disturbing historic case, starting at the former site of an unlikely series of crimes carried out over 40 years ago.
So Bovingdon is a small village in Hertfordshire. It's incredibly developed now, there's a lot of new housing being built. But in the 1970s, apart from a few pubs and the village shop, the major source of employment here was Hadlands factory.
The business carried on there was the making of high-speed lenses for cameras.
It was a great community of people. We all got on very well, certainly all on first name terms. Just a great environment.
But in 1971, all was not well at the lab. Former crime scenes officer Mick Grinstead recalls a summer of sickness for the photographic employees.
What was actually going on at the factory?
Stomach bugs, nausea, all that sort of stuff, and people going all sick.
Anthony Oddens was working in the factory at the time.
You had people who were being violently ill, but it seemed to be repeated several times, and it was clearly very, very unpleasant for them.
It was called in those days the Bovingdon bug.
The onset of the mystery illness had coincided with the arrival of a new storeroom assistant, 23-year-old Graham Young.
He was extremely articulate, and for somebody who was coming into what was supposedly simple job, it was just a bit unusual. I would say Graham was quite a loner. I don't remember him fitting into the other groups particularly.
Although viewed as solitary by his colleagues, trainee Graham Young was always keen to get involved during the factory's breaks.
They used to have a tea trolley lady who used to come round, and Graham would sort of hover and, oh, here's the tea.
Storeroom manager Bob Eagle gratefully accepted his trainee's hospitality. But in June 1971, Bob was seemingly struck down by the Bovingdon bug.
Stomach cramps, vomiting. He came back and forth from work a few times, but eventually was hospitalised.
Bob Eagle's condition gradually deteriorated. Inexplicably, paralysis spread through his body, and on the 7th of July, he died of a pneumonia-related illness.
When you're dealing with the employees, did you get any sense of what they were feeling?
They were very shocked because they didn't know what was going on.
In the wake of the storeman's death, his assistant, Graham Young, appeared particularly concerned.
The managing director decided that Young had been so close to Bob that he should represent the firm with him at the funeral.
Despite being a shoulder to cry on, the young storeman was anything but stable. Born in 1947, Graham Young was the second child of Fred and Margaret Young. Detective Jackie Sabir is in his childhood neighbourhood in northwest London, retracing a difficult start to life.
Tragically, his mother died when he was about 3 months old. And unable to cope with two very young children, Graham's father split his children up, and the young Graham spent his very early years with his Aunt Winifred.
Journalist Anthony Holden has extensively studied Graham Young's early years.
How did he get on with his aunt?
Well, he loved his aunt and her husband and their daughter. He was still very small, but I think he was very happy there, and his father used to visit at weekends.
But aged just 3, Graham Young would once again live with his father and a new stepmother.
So his stepmother Molly, what was her relationship like with the very young Graham?
I think it was pretty tense. She did a few things that upset him. For some reason she destroyed his model plane set. She became the classic wicked stepmother to Graham, I think.
Alongside an unsettled home life, Graham Young began to develop unusual behaviour as he progressed through his early years.
As he grew, he was clearly very intense, a bit of a loner, kept himself to himself, didn't really converse, and would stick in his own room doing things of his own choosing.
Still in his primary school years, Graham Young obsessively collected books on crime. Professor Lou Schlesinger is an expert at analysing the human mind. For him, Graham Young's abnormal childhood behaviour displays clear signs.
If you had to put a diagnostic label on Young, two traits come to mind: schizoid and obsessive. Schizoid personality is an individual who is withdrawn from other people. An obsessive individual is someone who's very meticulous and neat and detailed. You don't develop a schizoid personality because of events that happen to you. That's just how your personality is.
Some of history's most unpredictable killers suffered from mental issues in their formative years. In and out of psychiatric institutions from the age of 12, Londoner Patrick Mackay displayed unusual behaviour from an early age.
After school, we used to go exploring. He picked a bell-shaped flower, filled it up with his urine and drunk it in front of me, which I was absolutely gobsmacked, when he did that.
As a young adult, Nazi-obsessed Mackay would be driven to a mission of murder from whom no one was safe.
The priest had been found dead in a bath filled with blood.
This was a frenzied attack with a medieval weapon that caused horrific injuries and wounds.
He said that in the days leading up to a murder, he felt peculiar.
In Maryland, mentally unstable Haddon Clark's childhood was complicated by the disruptive views of a domineering father.
In his case, his father told him quite directly that he didn't want a son, he wanted a daughter.
He was caught dressing in his mother's clothing.
A neighbor came home and walked in his house and found Haddon dressed in his wife's clothing. And Haddon, of course, ran out of the house wearing these clothes, all upset.
In later life, diagnosed schizophrenic Haddon Clark would continue to wear women's clothes. But tragically, his delusional thoughts would lead to his cross-dressing being associated with death.
Most transvestites don't hurt anybody. They're basically harmless people. But Haddon Clark was a very mentally ill person. He eventually went on to kill women and then dress in their clothes. A very unusual case.
In 1958, in Neasden, London, socially awkward Graham Young's strained relationship with his stepmother continued. But outside the family home, the teenager had had some success.
So having passed his 11+ examination, he came to secondary school. What type of pupil was he when he was here? Was he a social child?
He had a few friends, some of whom regretted becoming his friends.
Clive Krieger was one of the few who was close to Graham Young. As a fellow pupil, he sat next to him in class.
Well, he was intelligent enough, so I quite liked communicating with him. But he had this association with really negative stuff. One of the things he liked doing was to play a pencil game, drawing with gallows. He would do it with me to try and get me hanging. That was his sort of attitude.
Other school children would pick up on this darker side of Graham Young's personality.
He was always set apart and a bit strange, rabbiting on about pet topics like Hitler and Nazism.
I am Jewish, and he would know that. I don't know whether he genuinely was supporting Hitler, but he deliberately sometimes combed his hair that way just to pee me off.
The eccentric Graham Young didn't shine academically, but he gained notoriety for one subject.
Graham was interested in chemistry. As it happens, so was I. So we were able to communicate and talk about stuff like that.
But the standout pupil's interest in the subject wasn't confined to the classroom. He started sourcing chemicals and toxins to satisfy a morbid curiosity.
He had a small mouse which he had in a large matchbox. He came to my house. He wanted to demonstrate how some of the toxins work. And we'd acquired a syringe from somewhere. and he injected the mouse and it died. He was working out, I think, dosages. He was studying those factors. And I think he was experimenting.
And soon, it wouldn't just be animals suffering at the hand of Graham Young. Forensic psychologist Lou Schlesinger and serving detective Jackie Sabir are investigating the historic case of one of the UK's most disturbed killers. In 1961, in Neasden, London, 13-year-old oddball chemistry genius Graham Young had started experimenting on small animals. But in the spring of that year, his subject matter took on an altogether different form.
There was a boy called Chris Williams who was one of his very few friends.
At one point, Williams went off formed a friendship with another schoolboy that Graham was jealous of. They actually had a fist fight that they challenged each other to.
The two school friends made up, but then out of the blue, Chris Williams fell ill.
Chris would have been sick or had stomach or diarrhea problems for a day, and Graham was amused by that.
Doctors put it down to gastroenteritis, but the reality was very different. Although barely a teenager, Graham Young was purchasing a rare chemical and poisoning his friend.
Was it established what poison Graham was actually using?
He managed to buy, unbelievably, from the local chemist, a rare poison called antimony potassium tartrate. He was only 13.
It's not so easy to buy a toxic substance, but he just persuaded them that he was doing experiments with them and they got it for him. He ordered it through them.
With a constant supply, Graham Young kept poison close to him at all times.
He was carrying at that time small bottles, vials, with antimony toxin in his stock pocket. He called it his friend.
As he slipped the antimony into Chris Williams' sandwiches, Graham Young confided in his friend Clive Krieger.
Graham told me about it after he'd done it. He was interested in having somebody, in that case it was me, know what was happening. I don't think he did it because he didn't like Chris. I think he was just experimenting.
Although his friend was forced to take time off school, Graham Young found new ways to administer his poisonous antimony.
He and Graham went on a day trip together to London Zoo, where Graham said, "Oh look, I've got something that'll make you feel better," and gave him a bottle of lemonade, which of course had him back in hospital before you knew it.
I don't think he was planning to kill him. I think it was just amusing for Graham to do what he did.
Despite being a close friend, at school lunchtime, Clive Krieger kept his distance from Graham Young.
I was concerned about it, which is why I was very careful about not eating or drinking anything that was anywhere near him. Very important.
Detective Jackie Sabir is meeting up with Professor of Toxicology Rob Chilcott to understand more about teenage Graham Young's sinister use of poison.
Graham Young used antimony salt, which is a salt which readily dissolves in water. It's been described as being slightly sweet and metallic, but if you were to mix that in with food or drink with a stronger flavour, you'd soon not notice that in your food and beverage.
So the amount within the vial there, what would that actually do to somebody?
That would be more than sufficient to cause profuse vomiting, probably within a matter of minutes.
Graham Young is known to have taken detailed notes, observing his friend's physical reactions.
What Graham Young was doing was establishing a dose-response relationship. And this is where you slowly increase the dose and see how that affects the outcome.
During the course of 1961, Graham Young was struggling to observe his poison victim, Chris Williams. As his spells off sick became more frequent, Young's new targets would be close to him at all times.
series of illnesses started happening inside his family. He had slightly frosty relations with his father, but his sister he was perfectly friendly with, but that made no difference to him at all. It was just total lack of any moral sense.
But Graham Young's main guinea pig was a family member whom he had resented since early childhood.
He told me he didn't like his stepmother. Basically, he was having problems with her and he didn't like the way she treated him. And he was giving her antimony.
One Easter Saturday, Fred got home to find his wife writhing in agony in the garden, throwing up on the floor, and noticed that Graham was just standing at the window watching this objectively rather than offering to help.
He would do graphs of giving drugs to his stepmother and her sickness. He kept her ill off and on and was working on the dosage to do that.
Young precisely administered his poison over the course of a year.
The truth was that Graham had been experimenting, not just with cups of tea. He also put dosages into the Sunday lunch.
I did try and tell a few adults, but they just thought I was a stupid kid.
In April 1962, Graham Young's stepmother Molly lost her life. Although doctors were unable to trace her stepson's poison, 14-year-old Graham Young went to extraordinary lengths to cover his tracks.
Following Molly's death, what happened? Was she buried? Was she interred?
Graham, already displaying a lot of expertise, persuaded his father it was much better these days to cremate her. And then, of course, he went to the funeral and literally watched the evidence of his crime go up in smoke.
But as Graham Young's family continued to show signs of ill health, the eccentric pupil's unusual questioning during chemistry classes started to raise suspicions.
Graham consistently would ask the science teacher about subjects related to lead poisoning and things like that. But I can still remember the science teacher having a strange look in his eye. You know, he was concerned.
The discovery of poison in Young's school desk would ultimately bring him to justice.
The psychiatrist was brought in to talk to him, and Graham talked with such expertise and arrogance about chemistry and eventually poisons that the psychiatrist called the alarm.
As police raided Graham Young's bedroom, alongside a series of diaries detailing his crimes, was an equally alarming hoard.
His room was festooned with Nazi memorabilia, swastikas, portraits of Hitler, books about Hitler. He swaggered around doing Hitler impersonations with his hairstyle like that, the toothbrush with the comb.
For Professor Lou Schlesinger, schizoid obsessive Graham Young's fascination with Nazism offers a revealing insight into his murderous behavior.
What part of the Nazis was he fascinated with? Nazi experimentation. In many of the concentration camps, the physicians were doing experimentation with human subjects. Use of poison gas is another way the Nazis killed people. So a lot of the things that the Nazis did to exterminate people are things that Young himself was very, very fascinated with.
Many of history's most deranged and unfathomable killers have seemingly been influenced by an extreme belief. During the 70s in Santa Cruz, schizophrenic John Frazier slayed a young family, claiming he had been driven by an environmental mission to murder.
He had an epiphany. He thought it was his job to come and save the planet.
He said he was going to go door to door like the Avon lady, saying, "Ding dong, you're dead."
In New York, during the mid-70s, serial killer David Berkowitz claimed an altogether different calling had driven him to murder.
He told us the devil told him to kill these women, and the devil communicated to him through the dog.
The irrational beliefs of Richard Trenton Chase led to him being labelled the Vampire of Sacramento.
Chase was a paranoid psychotic who was delusional. He had a delusion that his blood was evaporating and he needed to drink the blood of other living things to replenish his own blood.
Richard Chase now is doing things with small animals, killing them, drinking their blood.
In 1977, Chase turned to human prey to satisfy his deranged belief.
He made an incision down his stomach and that's an angle, and I found a used yogurt cup, and apparently he had been drinking the blood or doing something with the blood in that cup.
His murders were not, in my view, sexually motivated at all. They were a direct outgrowth of a delusion.
In 1962, in Neasden, London, Nazi-obsessed 14-year-old Graham Young had been arrested following the death of his stepmother and attempted poisoning of his father and sister. For Detective Jackie Sabir, the adolescent's MO is extremely revealing.
He wasn't someone that would physically be able to kill someone in terms of stabbing or strangling, that real up-close personal way of killing someone. With Graham Young, he seemed to take a great pleasure in watching suffering and was able to dehumanise, detach his emotions from what was going on.
Having persuaded his father to cremate his stepmother, Young would only be tried for poisoning his other family members and school friend Chris Williams.
He was sent to the hospital for the criminally insane, Broadmoor in Berkshire.
Having testified in court, former friend Clive Krieger was left with mixed feelings.
My reaction was one of relief, really, both for my own safety and security and my family, but I was concerned what would happen when he came out. You know, we used to get milk delivered outside in those days with a little metal cap on. He could have injected something into the milk bottles. I was concerned.
Aged just 14, the youngest patient since 1885, soon settled into his new life. For Graham Young, it was business as usual.
When he was in Broadmoor, he was still reading books on toxology. So everyone was on their toes around Graham. You know, the staff, the inmates, anyone who come into contact with him.
And the fanatical poisoner was already planning the next phase of his lifelong murderous experiment. In 1962, 14-year-old Londoner Graham Young was being treated in Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital, having poisoned his family and a close school friend. Although he was the institution's youngest patient, his sinister reputation preceded him.
Young was regarded by his fellow patients a bit warily, not least because he still went around showing off his knowledge of toxicology and poisons.
Imprisoned with Graham Young in later life, Bobby Cummins recalls a sinister character.
There was an aura about him that was sort of, it didn't fit well. You know, there was no link with humanity with him. He was like a dead man walking. There was no emotion, there was nothing there.
But serial poisoner Graham Young was keeping a close eye on his fellow patients.
He must have loved it going to Broadmoor, because what you had there was all these lab rats in a closed environment.
One patient mysteriously died of apparent cyanide poisoning.
Young claimed that he himself had extracted the cyanide from laurel bushes in the Broadmoor garden.
He could get the most innocent ingredients and turn them into a lethal cocktail of poison.
Despite his fellow patients keeping him at arm's length, teenage Graham Young was making a different impression on Broadmoor's staff.
His chief psychiatrist looked on the boy with great interest and hoped that he would make a full recovery.
He would have assessed them while they were trying to assess him. And my thoughts were they did not anticipate him being as smart as that.
In 1971, a seemingly reformed Graham Young was released back into the community. After a training period of 3 months, junior storeman Graham Young joined Hadland's photographic factory in Bovingdon. His new colleagues were unaware of his murderous identity.
We were told he was a trainee chemist who didn't pass his exams, so he's going through a retraining, and so fine, he was allowed to, live and let live.
But Graham Young's focus was on death. Throughout the summer of '71, he slipped poison into his colleague's tea. Tragically, storeman Bob Eagle had lost his life, and more employees were falling ill. At a later date, Detective Brendan Hayden would see the terrible toll on the victims firsthand.
I was asked to go and interview Jethro Batt, who at this stage was in hospital. He lost an awful lot of his hair. He told me the pain was so excruciating. And one of the worst things he said were the hallucinations he was having. He saw himself in a World War trench, I remember him telling me, with bayonets coming down on him. He told me if he'd had a shotgun, he'd have shot himself.
Jethro Batt would eventually recover from his horrific ordeal. His suffering had been down to Graham Young's most lethal chemical. Thallium had replaced antimony as his poison of choice.
Comparing antimony with thallium, is thallium a more potent poison?
Yes, this is roughly about 10 times more toxic in general than antimony. You absorb more, which would explain why there's a difference in lethal dose.
So once it has been dissolved and it's put in a cup of tea, would you be able to taste it?
Well, the other thing about thallium in comparison with antimony is that it's practically tasteless.
How much thallium would you need to ingest then for it to be fatal?
As little as 1/10 of a gram has been known to kill people.
In the photographic factory in Bovingdon, 2 months had passed since Bob Eagle's death. Senior staff member Fred Biggs was Graham Young's latest target. For Detective Jackie Sabir, Young's written observations of the manager's deterioration give a chilling insight into the killer's obsessional mind.
On the 17th of November, he writes, "The latest news from the hospital is that F is responding to treatment. He is being obstinately difficult. I am most annoyed. He is surviving far too long for my peace of mind." So we've got the clear modus operandi being displayed, but we've also got his response. He expected Fred to die very quickly. It's almost like this is an experiment and this isn't working properly.
Fred Biggs would eventually die in November 1971, having ingested over 100 grams of thallium. Both he and other murder victim Bob Eagle had got on well with their junior colleague, Graham Young.
Bob and Fred were both lovely people. I mean, they really were. And I can imagine them being very encouraging to Graham as they saw it as a protege who they were training effectively. And that's part of the obscenity of the whole thing, really.
Everyone was nice to him. Just again, chose them because they were available.
For Professor Lou Schlesinger, Graham Young's apparently motiveless murders were purely a byproduct of his obsessive mission in life.
He wanted to see how poison would affect people. This fascinated him. He was obsessed with this. Young is a schizoid individual who didn't have really much interpersonal connectedness with other people. And he really didn't care if the person died. They were guinea pigs, basically, to him.
Like Graham Young, some of history's most disturbed killers have simply viewed their victims as a means to an end. In the early 1970s, in Santa Cruz, no one was safe from Herbert Mullin and his delusional quest to save the planet.
The voices told him that he was, one of the chosen people, and that it was God's plan that people had to be sacrificed.
He was going to prevent cataclysmic earthquakes by killing people.
He killed women, he killed wealthy people, homeless people. He's responding to psychotic symptoms, hallucinations and delusions, and it was just to kill. So his victim selection was basically random.
I was a good Catholic. I said my prayers every day. Between October 13th, 1972 and February 13th, 1973, I did in fact murder 13 people.
There's a lot of material about the 12 apostles plus one, clearly implying that he was the 13th disciple of God.
There wasn't power and control. He wasn't a psychopath. He was extremely mentally ill. He's a very, very sick guy and remains very sick today.
In 1971, in Bovingdon, Hertfordshire, a second employee at a photographic lab had lost his life at the hand of schizoid obsessive Graham Young's teacup poisoning. Despite his odd character, no one suspected the young storeman.
You'd have probably looked at him and thought, harmless, sort of dopey person, quiet, no problem at all. Make the tea, Graham. But he was a very, very dangerous human being.
But as authorities struggled to find a cause for the deaths, Graham Young was about to expose himself as a killer in an extraordinary display that would dumbfound all around him. In 1971, in Bovingdon, Hertfordshire, junior storeman Graham Young had been poisoning his colleagues in a photographic lab. As a second man lost his life, police were struggling to find a cause. 23-year-old chemistry genius Young had covered his tracks, but his misguided ego was about to get the better of him.
The company's doctor has visited the staff here to sort of brief them and talk to them. Something unusual happened, I believe, during that briefing.
A member of staff, i.e. Graham Young, started asking the doctor these questions that the doctor thought was very suspicious.
Graham Young piped up and said, well, do you not think the symptoms would demonstrate that there's something more serious here? Then quoting a whole series of technical terms that would match poisoning.
He wants to be in control of the situation generally, to the point where he doesn't realise he's giving himself away, which of course he was.
Then we got the phone call.
Former Detective Constable Mick Grinstead was sent to search Graham Young's bedsit in nearby Hemel Hempstead.
They come up in the street, go to the flat.
Yeah.
It was about 10, 11 o'clock at night, I think.
Yeah.
The night was terrible. It was raining, windy, black.
So what did you actually find?
Hanging in front of the wardrobe was a corduroy jacket. We got the top pocket, and there's a file, a glass file, with a cork in it, with something in it.
Described years earlier by a teenage Young as his friend, the dose of poison now had an ominous role.
It turned out to be Valium. And according to Young, subsequently, that was his, what he called his exit dose, should he be arrested or discovered or whatever.
But as the search of the bedsit continued, other evidence would reveal an even darker side to Graham Young.
And there was a writing pad. Looking through that, that was when the nerves come on and started twangling, I think. There were some drawings, ghoulish drawings, in black ink of people. I remember some big finger pointing into a grave, a tombstone.
And Graham Young had also continued his teenage obsession, meticulously recording observations of his
See? It works, doesn't it?
There was the diary. It had
doing it that way.
Things like went to the hospital to see Bob.
Easy.
Took a bottle of brandy to make sure he didn't wake up.
On reading it and the accounts that were in there, how did that make you feel?
I suppose really it was eureka, you know.
Is that
We've got it. Yeah.
Got a moment.
As the evidence stacked up, Graham Young was taken into custody. 8 months later, in July 1972, he would deny all charges in court. As a reporter, Anthony Holden attended the trial.
So I sat eyes on him for the first time across the courtroom, and it was a pretty chilling sight. He was the only witness in his own defense.
As the disturbed defendant faced up to his own damning diary notes, Graham Young devised a tall tale to talk his way out of his crimes at the photo lab.
He made out that this poisoner's diary was a novel he was writing to try and explain the events at this factory.
But a letter written by Young to Anthony Holden was completely at odds with his impassioned defense.
He sent me a note across the courtroom via his solicitor saying, I want you to get me into the Chamber of Horrors in Madame Tussauds. I want to go down in history as a famous poisoner.
Although it appeared Graham Young yearned for fame, forensic psychologist Lou Schlesinger believes his extraordinary letter is purely an indication of his haphazard mental state.
I think he said it to the reporter in sort of a flippant way, but really, I don't think Young cared how anybody saw him. A schizoid individual is very different. He lived in his own world. He was just interested in how poisons affect people.
Many disturbed killers who have been driven by a mindless mission have displayed unpredictable behavior in court. Like Graham Young, mentally ill Herbert Mullin took to the stand.
He basically gave us all a lecture.
I felt that my family were sort of playing a killjoy sadistic game on my life, on my mind.
Schizophrenic killer John Frazier altered his appearance to get his message across.
The entire half of his head and face were shaved. And he would sit at the table and kind of turn one way and show the audience that perspective, and he would turn the other way and show a different person.
You can interpret his behavior as trying to represent a split personality, good versus evil, and so on. I would not interpret it that way. I would just say it was a stunt. You can reach the same conclusion without him shaving his head off. Just look at what he did.
In July 1972, Graham Young was found guilty of 2 murders and 2 attempted murders. Despite his severe psychological issues, he pleaded not to be returned to a mental institution.
He said, I do not want to go back to Broadmoor. And so he was sentenced to life imprisonment in a conventional prison.
Bobby Cummins spent time with Graham Young in Parkhurst. Despite the fact it housed Britain's most violent killers, Young would be feared the most.
The joke went round the neck that all the weirdos went to the Vicar's Tea Party except Graham. You know, and that's really saying how bad this guy was. Prisoners, if they ever heard that he went near a kitchen, no one would eat that day.
Graham Young died of heart failure in 1990. In the wake of his death, many have analysed his seemingly mindless murders. For Detective Jackie Sabir, his irrational desire to be recognised was all-consuming.
There's every possibility that Graham Young actually might have got away with what he did. In putting his hand up at that meeting with the doctor, he was worried that people hadn't noticed what he had done. He wanted to draw attention to his master plan.
If you look back, there's the early days in school with the books he was reading and his ambition to be known as a famous poisoner. He wanted to be the top one.
Graham Young joins a class of killer who seemingly possess scarily bent minds, from whom no one is safe.
They don't care about other people and how other people view them. The types of murders that we're talking about are extraordinary murders. Traditional law enforcement approaches to investigation, motive, method, opportunity, that goes out the window because it's very, very different in those cases.
With serial killers, you mostly find that it's rape, it's anger, it's racial. With Graham Young, he didn't have none of those hatreds. To him, he just wanted to see how long it took to kill you.
And I noticed a smell and I said, "What's that smell?" And Stephen had told me it was the dead body of the lizard in his rucksack.
Forensic psychologist Lou...
Right, I'm going to call it now, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I will see you guys later on. Lots of love. Take care, everyone. Bye.